From the beginning of this present century, something strange seems to have happened in the Western intellectual world. An extensive movement has arisen and has addressed the subject of metaphysics, but in a new way, and this continues strongly to the present day. Although many of its proponents publish books, the content is perhaps most in evidence on the social media platform YouTube. Certainly it is through YouTube that I have become aware of them. In order to characterize this movement, if that is what it is, I will mention two concepts that are typical of those that these thinkers put forward. One is the idea that we have no free will. The other is the idea that the life we know is not real, but a simulation created by some unspecified outside agent. There are many other positions taken by different individuals of this movement, and I will refer to these briefly in future talk. I would not mention these ideas except that they have a huge profile on YouTube with hundreds of thousands of followers. Criticism of these views or any real debate about them is rare. Most videos displaying a mere passing of bouquets between the participants. I am going to call this new metaphysics nihilism or nihilistic metaphysics. For me, they are the opposite of attractive, for as I have sketched out, they contain dangerous political implications. These, their proponents, never discuss. Metaphysical nihilism, with its rejection of consciousness, free will, and the reality of our world, is life-denying and anti-human. First, let me state the following. For a statement to be considered philosophical, whether or not it might be true, good or bad, it must satisfy the following three conditions. Firstly, coherence. Secondly, plausibility. 3, usefulness. Consider these three in turn. Coherence. A philosophical statement must be coherent, for otherwise it does not admit of discussion. The founder of Western philosophy is Plato, and he made clear that what he called the dialectic must be applicable to philosophical concepts and ideas. For Plato, the dialectic entails discussion, and that validates philosophical ideas or not, as the case may be. This distinguishes philosophical ideas from mystical or religious ideas, to which the discussion is not applied. These are called dogmas. That is not to say they have no value. It is simply saying they are not part of philosophy. Take the idea that free will does not exist that I mentioned earlier. Is it coherent? At root, you will have to have free will to propose that free will does not exist. So there is an internal contradiction. And of course, this is never addressed. And what is the justification? Where is the empirical evidence? I suggest there is none. It is a fanciful idea, and it has no coherence. As regards the world being a simulation and so lacking reality, I suppose we could grant this coherence to a degree, just about. We have all seen sophisticated computer simulations and can see how a parallel can be drawn between those and some supposed simulation of the entire universe. But parallels do not make for real coherence. Now consider plausibility. Moving on to this criteria, but sticking with simulation for a moment, I think to most people this is an implausible idea. Plausibility ultimately is subjective, and if people want to say a simulated universe in which we ourselves are part of a simulation, like a giant Truman show, is plausible, then we cannot stop them. But to the majority, it's absurd. As regards denying free will, ideas like this that do not satisfy the criteria of coherence will not be able to be subjected to that of plausibility, for we cannot judge the plausibility of an idea we cannot understand. So the idea of there being no free will is not plausible. Now let's look at usefulness. If an idea is not useful in the sense that it has no meaning or relevance to our society or civilization, then why should we bother with it? The major problem with the idea of the absence of free will and of simulation is not that they are just not useful, but that they are positively harmful. Their measure of usefulness is thus negative. To talk of the individual life as we know it being an illusion is not just incoherent, but dangerous. For what sort of political philosophy can you construct from this view of the individual? I would suggest that it can only be a very ugly one. How can you discuss central ideas of a humanist political philosophy, such as freedom or democracy, as they might apply to a person with no free will to act as they wish? This idea is not just useless, but counter-useless. The proponents of the non-existence of free will and life being all an illusion generally do not ask this question, but I do. As regards the usefulness of the idea of experience as a simulation, it hardly seems worthy of comment. This is a great idea in science fiction, if a somewhat overworked one, but the only people who would take it seriously are either those who make a living by doing so, or those who have lost their sense of reality. Philosophy must be considered speculative in its endeavor and speculative in its conclusions. No philosophical statement can be absolutely proven. If it could be, it would not be philosophy, but something else. So we have got straight that philosophy is about rationality and testing, and we have dismissed the idea that can ever be more than speculation. That is, it can never be proven as true science and mathematics can be. But what is still missing here is a sense of what philosophy is and what it is actually about. Speculation can be wild as you like, but that cannot be what interests us. The word that we need here to complete our overview of philosophy is metaphysics. Yes, I know, here we go again, more slippery rocks. Metaphysics is what philosophy is about. It may discuss other things, such as ethics, aesthetics, God, perception, action, values, and so on, but all these must be given a metaphysical dimension or relevance if they are to be included within a philosophical discourse. So what is metaphysics? A metaphysical statement or claim is one that refers to elements of the highest generality. This is so high that it is above and beyond physical explanations about the physical world, which can normally be proven. Grand in scale though this may sound, it is important to understand that at the same time, metaphysics puts a limit on the scope of our discussion, for it can only refer to things in the philosophical cosmos that we know. It cannot cross the line into the supernatural, for instance, for that would be to stray into the territory of religion. Discussing the subject of metaphysics does not alone mean the discussion is philosophical, for as I have stated, the requirement of coherence, plausibility, and usefulness must be met. If something exists in the world, we know that we can approach it with metaphysics. For instance, our minds exist in the physical world, so they fall within the compass of this discussion. That is not to say that we will reduce minds to physical workings and collisions between microscopic particles, as our friends associated with positivism would have it. Far from it. But if something is here and now with us in this world, whether it has a definable, visible, physical dimension or not, then it is legitimately part of our study. Metaphysical nihilism, which I mentioned in talk 1, is prominent on YouTube, and it is thereby that I've become acquainted with some of its many advocates. For me, their ideas are so repellent that I have to limit my exposure to them. But to summarize briefly, they all seek denial of what normally would be regarded as fundamental aspects of humanity and the human condition. Each performer has their own preoccupations, but variously they contrive to tell me. 1, that I have no free will because free will does not exist anywhere. 2, that the world I know is one big illusion, like a video game. 3, that the world I think I know as my world actually does not exist, but is all inside my head. 4, that I have no consciousness whatever because consciousness does not exist anywhere. 5, that there is only one universal consciousness of which my consciousness is a part, is a component, like a headset. 6, that every idea ever dreamt of has of equal value, so there is nothing of real value. This is integral theory. 7, or that everything has consciousness, even atoms or inanimate objects, so my consciousness has little real meaning. This is panpsychism. 8, that consciousness and life can be reduced to inert matter, materialism. 9, that a great upshift is underway and that is outside the control of any individual, and so we must all jump on board. This comes from Laszlo. And so on. What all these ideas have in common is that they assault the individual and thereby assault humanity. Their method is to present arguments that seek to disprove what ordinary people think of as essential elements of their reality. This is an entirely negative project. It represents an ardent attack on humanity and civilization that its exponents wish, for their own reasons, to pursue. For this reason, I call it metaphysical nihilism, for its methods employ metaphysics and its message is nihilist. Their arguments are presented with no attempt at proof except perhaps to invoke science or quasi-science in support. And in this they reveal their mystical or New Age roots. They particularly favor quantum physics for some reason. Needless to say, none of them ever mention virtue, ethics, goodness, or beauty. These have no place in their worldview, and all proclaim to be atheists, of course. All of the ideas they put forward are blatantly anti-human. So they are very dangerous, and their wide currency threatens our civilized values. I suppose their advocates would say they are interested in the truth, regardless of its implications for society and morality. But as I explained in Talk 1, they do not follow the methods of truth because their ideas do not meet the criteria of coherence, plausibility, and usefulness. That metaphysical nihilists never go beyond the metaphysics they expound in order to explore its meaning for society. But the implications of their metaphysics are undoubtedly communitarianism means subjecting your individual free will to a collective will. That is it. Communitarianism as an idea preceded Marxism and communism and historically, but the identification between the two is clear. By undermining any sense of the individual, metaphysical nihilists create a void in society. They do not express any interest in society, but society is there nevertheless. Wherever there's a void in society, something will fill it, and the lack of the individual automatically creates the collective. So although they do not say so in so many words, it is clear that metaphysical nihilism is supportive of the aims of the globalists who wish to deny our humanity and reduce our free will through communitarianism. These ideas are never subject to open discussion with those of a different point of view. I'm sorry if that got a bit political, but it is unavoidable when what pretends to be philosophy strays so closely to a political agenda. Having said that, Philosophy cannot but be, by its nature, political, because political influences can be drawn from it. That is why it is well acknowledged that philosophy is important and influential. If a philosophy contains a malign element, then its effect on the political arena will be malign. As the 20th century progressed, Western philosophy was not in good shape. It used to be useful to distinguish continental philosophy and English-speaking philosophy, whereby the former was indebted heavily to the phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger, and the latter focused on language and positivism. This no doubt oversimplified division broadly held good to the last postmodernists of the French school. When Jacques Derrida died in 2004, this effectively ended the lineage of France for philosophy. And the latter postmodernists, usually called post-structuralists, had gained a foothold in English-speaking academia, especially in American universities. This implanted the idea, which I have referred to before, whereby the reaction of the recipient of a statement is equally important to, or may take precedence over, the objective truth of the statement. This scandalous proposition is a corruption of the insight of phenomenology, whereby the subject must play a part in any perception, so suggesting how subject and object do not admit of a sharp distinction. This relatively modest claim surely corresponds to our experience of life and the world around us. This development from post-structuralism, especially at first in the US, produced the hideous wokeism in all its differently packaged varieties. This ultra-subjectivism is a deliberate refutation of civilization, for the latter cannot function if there is no attempt at and no recognition of the need for a consensus. We need not dwell on this malign turn here, but duly note its dominance in much of Western academia. Against this heritage from the earlier continental philosophy, the contemporary Anglophone philosophy against which we contrast it seems to still be alive in some quarters, still arguing over matters of language and logic that have not admitted of a generally accepted solution after 100 years and more, and we can safely assume never will. However much well-paid academic time is devoted to them. So that is a brief, probably biased sketch of the state of Western philosophy as the 20th century turned. What might seem strange is that there is nowhere in there anything about the traditional, I would say fundamental, concern of philosophy, namely metaphysics, at least not explicitly. The true phenomenology of the Germans had a metaphysical component, but once its stream moved to France, this was lost. Whatever he was, Sartre was not a metaphysician. Existentialism is too personal and too literary to qualify. Derrida et al. Are not interested in metaphysics, and if you mention cosmology to them, they would probably not understand what you were talking about. The only 20th century Western metaphysics lay with individuals not associated with any school, for instance, Whitehead, Jaspers, and Santayana, but all of their works on the subject were published before the second half of the century, and while respected in many quarters, have not been developed subsequently. It is to this group, or rather a figure who is of central importance to them, that I am now going to turn. This may seem like a strange twist, but all will become clear. The date of the coining of the term hard problem of consciousness can be traced exactly to 1994, when the philosopher David Chalmers gave a talk at the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, Arizona. He has often returned to the so-called hard problem, and I am taking the following from a recent presentation at Yale. Here he states the problem, which can be conveyed in just 16 words.
The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to conscious experience.
He helpfully provided this caption, stating the problem, which has not changed since its original outing in 1994.
The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to conscious experience.
The problems concerning consciousness have always been around, but in this talk, Chalmers gives them a focus, and as it happened, he hit on a subject that was ready to enter the philosophical debate, mostly, it would seem, on the Anglophone side of the old 20th century divide. The hard problem was a gift to philosophers who make their living by writing books and papers, so securing their academic positions, for because it was so very, very hard, it effectively admitted of no solution, making the task of solving it subject to endless research. But it achieved more than that from what I can see, for it opened metaphysics up as a subject of philosophy, where it had, until then, as I said, been a backwater. Putting the subject of consciousness on the map allowed it to become a real subject for inquiry. And furthermore, a whole raft of related subjects was opened up, creating a field day for academics. For reasons that are not clear to me, all these lines of inquiry sought to challenge the existence of reality or some aspects of it, such as consciousness itself, hence my term metaphysical nihilism. I set out a provisional list of these in Talk 2 as follows, where I put it in personal terms. They variously assert that, 1, that I can have no free will, because free will does not exist anywhere. 2, or that the world I know is one big illusion, like a video game. 3, or that the world I think I know as my world actually does not exist, but is all inside my head. This is New Age idealism. 4, or that I have no consciousness whatever, because consciousness does not exist anywhere. 5, or that there is only a universal consciousness, of which my consciousness is just a component, or as it is sometimes put, headset. Or that everything has consciousness, even atoms or inanimate objects, so my consciousness has little meaning. This is panpsychism. 7, or that consciousness and life can be reduced to inert matter, materialism, and so on. Now, I want to make it clear that Chalmers himself was not deliberately responsible for the can of worms he appears to have opened. And he is no nihilist, for he clearly states that he is a realist as regards consciousness. In other words, he holds that consciousness is real, not some kind of chimera or false impression we have, as many of the nihilists would have it. But the problem is that his statement of the hard problem contains within it a basic logical flaw. Neither he nor the subsequent metaphysical nihilists seem to be remotely aware of this contradiction, so it is an ill-directed debate, continuing without any conclusion or indeed any possibility of such. Let us return to Mr. Chalmers' presentation of his thesis, which he puts succinctly thus. To be fair to him, we should follow his argument a little further, and so he continues.
The locution "the hard problem" is meant to contrast with other problems of consciousness and of cognition more generally, the so-called easy problems, which aren't easy in any absolute sense. They're as hard as any problem in science, but they're called the easy problem because we've got some at least better grip on how to go about explaining them. These are basically problems of explaining behavioral or cognitive functions, like, say, perceptual discrimination, the integration of information in the brain, the control of behavior, and indeed verbal reports, like saying, I see that object now. These are all, relatively objective features of the human system. We have a fairly standard paradigm for explaining them in cognitive science.
So a part of consciousness involves what he calls behavioral or cognitive functions, or what I would term simply actions and perceptions. These are called the easy problems of consciousness, and they are easy because he says he knows how to deal with them, which is as follows.
Roughly, we handle the easy problems, these problems of explaining behavioral or cognitive functions, by finding a neural or computational mechanism that performs the relevant function. Maybe a neural system, maybe some kind of algorithmic mechanism, but once you've explained how it is that that function is performed, you've explained the problem. He
says we simply need to find a neural or computational mechanism that performs the relevant function. As I read it, this means we must discover some kind of trigger in the brain that sets off the action or responds to the sensory input. So a happening in the brain corresponds to a happening in the body being the interface with the external world. He says that once you have explained how it is that function is performed, you have explained the problem. Or in my terms, once you have found the correspondence between brain activity and bodily activity, you have completed the task. Job done. Incidentally, you will notice how a philosophical problem has been turned into a problem of neural medicine. In other words, a problem in science. Now, in talk 4, I talked at length about the dangers of mixing up science with philosophy. Science is part of our external reality, whereas philosophy belongs to the internal reality, and these two realities do not intermix. We understand them as entirely separate realities. This does not represent a division of our consciousness, as in fact, it is consciousness that knows these different realities and embraces all aspects of them. The problem arises when we try to explain what we know in one reality by reference to the other. This cannot be done without an absolute loss of cogency, because the terms of the external reality are entirely different from those of the internal reality. To speak here specifically to Chalmers' argument, I would hold that neural actions and reactions in the brain have no relation to consciousness that we could ever define. Consciousness is whole and complete and cannot be dissected down to microscopic elements. I have taken here a phenomenological view as opposed to a scientific view, which invariably aims at reduction. So Chalmers claims that once you have explained how it is that neurological function is performed, you have explained the problem. It's preposterous. In terms of philosophy, which is where he would claim to locate his arguments, he hasn't explained anything at all. The invocation of neural science is a slight. Few of his audience seem to understand that using science as a prop in this way has no legitimacy, and he and his colleagues get away with it time and time again. Philosophers of old never used science to bolster a philosophical argument, and so we can assume they well understood the absolute separation of science and philosophy. Even if they did not set it out specifically, they did not need to. I strongly suspect that this substantial methodological error crept into philosophy when New Age thinking became current, for New Age unashamedly commandeers science to support its claims of a philosophical, spiritual, or mystical nature. So today's audiences are primed to accept this connection without questioning it. I won't be going through the whole of Chalmers' talk, but let us just pick out a couple of more comments of his on the hard problem to give us a flavor of his thought and to buttress his primary statement. Chalmers suggested that there are three possible approaches to dealing with the hard problem of consciousness. The first approach is to describe consciousness as irreducible.
And there are many different approaches to the hard problem, coming both from the side of metaphysics and philosophy, or from the side of the science of consciousness. I mean, there are approaches that take consciousness to be irreducible in nature, and this is actually the side which I have somewhat more sympathy for, and that I've argued myself in some earlier work, that consciousness could be fundamental and irreducible in the same way that space and time and mass are often taken to be. This leads you to views like dualism. Consciousness is distinct from any physical properties, but is somehow in interaction with them. Or panpsychism, that there's some element of consciousness at the base of all physical systems. Or even idealism, that the whole world is itself a construct of consciousness.
So what he is saying here is that we have on the one hand physical processes and on the other conscious experience, but there exists between these what he calls in his talk an explanatory gap. In other words, we have no idea how we can connect the two. But if we theorize that consciousness is irreducible, this means that regarding consciousness as primary in respect of physical processes. Here I am paraphrasing his argument somewhat. I will consider only the last of the first of the three versions of this approach, namely idealism, as it seems to me the only one that carries any weight. Now here, the word idealism is being used in a sense it is used in modern, that is to say, post-classical philosophy. Idealism here has nothing to do with some perfect ideal, as might be implied by Plato, but refers to the philosophical theory that says the world we know does not exist in the way we normally think it does, but rather is a construction of the human mind or human consciousness. In common sense terms, this sounds like pure nonsense, but the idea has gained a lot of traction in Western philosophy since it was put forward in a fully worked out form by Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century. Idealism is included by Chalmers as a response to the hard problem, as indeed it is. Idealism effectively gets rid of one side of the problem, namely the physical processes, leaving only conscious experience as comprising the entire reality. This does not exactly solve the hard problem, but dissolves it away, for it cannot exist with only one side of the equation. But it only works if you are an idealist, and Chalmers certainly is not one. He would argue, as I would, that there is no justification for just jettison the reality of the world around us. As I said, he makes this clear, and he is a realist. It goes without saying that some metaphysical nihilists would have no problem with this. Some of them have their own version of idealism. Let us consider the claim that the primary element of the cosmos is not inert matter, but consciousness itself. In this, the hard problem is reversed. We are left to imagine how inert matter and everything in the cosmos is constructed by consciousness instead of the other way around. This is the position held by idealists. And this would include Kant and his followers, as well as idealists in the metaphysical nihilist camp. Idealism is a gift to the metaphysical nihilists, for it enables them to deny the existence of the entire world at a stroke. Modern idealism of this kind was first proposed by Kant, and it contains two major logical problems that bedevils all of this idealism. The problems arise from the fact that consciousness depends on existence for an individual life. And as we know, any individual life is fragile and has a temporary tenure on the world. Not only is its existence temporary, but there are millions of other such existences, and all must have different worlds built around them. You cannot construct the whole of reality off the back of something so ephemeral and diverse. Logically, the physical world is not unitary, but has millions of different versions. But Kant and his followers discuss it as if it was unitary. But it cannot be unitary if it is constructed out of myriad individuals' experience that constantly come and go. I am not aware of this point ever being satisfactorily addressed by defenders of idealism, nor can it ever be, for the logic just does not work. The second approach he outlines is the reverse of the first, for here consciousness is now reducible rather than irreducible.
Another set of options is that consciousness is reducible, perhaps to some kind of computational or functional process, as popular functionalist views hold, perhaps to something really distinctively biological. That's biological materialism. Some people have even speculated maybe there's something essentially quantum mechanical about consciousness. We can reduce it to some kind of quantum materialism. And there's been a big debate about these options here in both the metaphysics and the science of consciousness.
As with the first approach, he gives three versions of this, but all boil down to the idea that you can divide and pick consciousness apart as you would dissect a physical material to analyze its properties and so give some sort of definition. He does not at this point say anything new, for this was already covered in the so-called easy problems of consciousness. And I quoted him saying, once you have explained how it is that a function is performed, you have explained the problem. Or in my terms, once you have found the correspondence between brain activity and bodily activity, you have completed the task, and there is nothing more to say. The third approach to the hard problem is the one that Professor Chalmers explores mainly in the talk I am quoting from, and this means, as he says, to go meta.
Approach. The third approach is to do what Douglas Hofstadter called jumping out of the system and going meta. So instead of trying to solve the problem, we ask instead, why is it that we think that consciousness poses a problem? And when you ask the question in this way, I think it just gives you just a different angle on the problem that comes with all kinds of promising new directions. One way to get at this is to look at various behavioral functions that are closely related to the hard problem. I mean, the hard problem is about experience, not about behavior, but there are behavioral functions that are very closely connected, not least that we make what I'll call phenomenal reports.
So we stand back from the problem as we have set it up and think around it and beyond it in the hope that a new perspective will be forthcoming that will give us a new way into the original problem. This includes, as it turns out, surveys of how people regard the hard problem of consciousness. If, as if a consensus of what people think could have any bearing on a philosophical problem. A philosophical problem can only be investigated by logic and the dialectic, not some kind of popular input or vox pop. The development of this third approach takes up the bulk of this lecture, and I do not pretend to be able to follow it completely. Indeed, I have only gone beyond the original formulation of the hard problem to give it some context in Chalmers' thought. His subsequent explanations do not appear to me to provide any kind of resolution to the original problem as stated, so I will say no more about them. Return to the core statement. This succinct statement contains within it a fallacy, the recognition of which does not solve the whole hard problem. Once we see the fallacy, we can dismiss the hard problem of consciousness as a real problem and open up an entirely new, fruitful avenue of discovery. We distance ourselves from the endless struggle that Chalmers and his colleagues get stuck into and produce a new, enlightened interpretation of the world. I invoke the conditions of a philosophical theory that I set out in Talk 1 when I say this interpretation will be logically coherent, plausible, and useful to humanity. As so often, when we encounter a seemingly intractable problem in any field, we need to go back and examine the assumptions we have made in the formulation of that problem. If those assumptions are reasonable or unreasonable or incorrect, then the problem is never going to admit of a solution. This is the case with the hard problem of consciousness. The fallacy lies in the words to give rise to. The assumption embodied in this phrase is that the physical processes caused conscious experience in some way. The statement is taking physical processes to mean processes of inert matter with no consciousness itself and no life. How could consciousness emerge from this state of affairs? It reminds me of an equally hard problem that Charles Darwin had in explaining how the first life forms emerged. His solution was that there exists a primal soup in which somehow the necessary molecules and other constituents came together, and by chance the first living cells came into existence. This naive theory is still given credence by neo-Darwinists today. No attempt has ever been made to test it in a laboratory, but then this is so of all the claims made by Darwin's theory of evolution. Chalmers does not resort to a primal soup as generating consciousness, but battles ahead with logic as providing a solution for the main part, as I have indicated with citations from his paper above. In my terms, the professor is putting forward a theory concerning the cosmic order. Of course, he does not use this term, but the theory is implied nevertheless. He is saying that in the history of the cosmos or universe, there first existed inert matter and inert matter alone, and that consciousness somehow emerged from this purely unconscious, unliving state of affairs. This is a theory of a fundamental aspect of the cosmic order. He is honest enough to admit he cannot explain satisfactorily how this happened. Hence, we come up against the hard problem. He does not think to free up the argument with a consideration of the assumptions he is making in the problem's formulation, so it becomes solidified and intractable. His colleagues in the philosophical world grapple with the problem, and I frequently hear them say that they are on the verge of a breakthrough. We just need to work at it for a bit longer and a bit harder. This breakthrough will never come, for the problem as formulated is just not hard to solve, but downright impossible to solve. This because it begins by imposing erroneous assumptions on the nature of reality. The main assumption is that physical processes are primary, while conscious experiences are secondary. This assumption is made without any prior attempt to evaluate its truth or not, but that is the nature of assumptions. I refer here in passing to my previous comments regarding axioms. Philosophical theories use axioms upon which they build their claims. These axioms are not at root nothing more than assumptions but these words are rarely mentioned as being essential to philosophical constructs. So the axioms or assumptions remain unstated and unacknowledged. This is a primary defect, for if you do not acknowledge the foundational elements of your thought, you are unlikely to be aware of how they might lead to grand errors. The test of the validity of your arguments will, in the first place, be that it does not produce any hard problems. Such problems are like blockages in the works and should tell us there is something radically wrong with our model. There is something wrong with our assumptions, something not right with the axioms upon which we are basing our theory. As I have stated, there are two aspects of the cosmic order, and these are synchronic and diachronic. The synchronic is how the system looks when regarded as a single snapshot in time, while the diachronic shows it moving and changing in time. The diachronic thus contains what is called a cosmogony, that is to say, a theory of the origins of the cosmos and how it develops. You cannot have a full description of the cosmic order without having the same time having a cosmogony. For comparison, the orthodox cosmic order, exemplified by Professor Chalmers' exposition, consists of one primary element, that of inert materiality. And out of this, everything else is constructed, including human consciousness. In trying to account for how this construction works, he comes up against his hard problem. The diachronic aspect pertaining to his cosmogony is barely sketched out, but to be sure, it is there in the supposition that a cosmos consists of only inert matter, and this somehow leads to one where there is consciousness, however that is defined. He mentions that idealism might provide a response to the hard problem, as I have referred to, but idealism presupposes that consciousness is primary, and so it is impossible to even begin to construct a cosmogony out of this material. It is not coherent to imagine that the cosmos started off with consciousness, something that, as I alluded to above, is natural only to individual lives. This does not begin to make logical sense. I am going to now set out some basic principles of my theory of the cosmic order. Under my cosmic order, the primary element is not inert matter, and neither is it consciousness. It is life. Life is the ultimate driver of the cosmos, and without it, there would be nothing. This is not saying that life exists in everything, including, for instance, inert materiality, as some mystics, for instance, would have it. Inert matter is inert, devoid of life, but as we shall see, it plays an essential part in the realization of life. It might be thought that life as the primary force in the world might create a problem of cosmogony, for we know with a more or less absolute certainty that there existed a time when there was no life in the universe, as is attested by the well-established astrophysical theories of the universe. Life somehow evolved out of what I sometimes refer to as inertia, that is, inert matter. How could this happen? Darwin said that it happened by accident in his primal soup that bubbled away like a fumarole at Yellowstone Park and accidentally produced the first life. I think, honestly, this theory has had a good run for its money. Life itself did not always exist, but the potential for it did. Life emerged as follows. There are two elements of the cosmos that have always existed and always will. They are not unchanging, but they are always there. They are entirely different and opposite in nature. I call these the subcosm and the metacosm. These two together embody the process that can lead to the emergence of life. Life does not automatically emerge, for certain specific physical conditions must be present for this to happen. Whether these physical conditions exist or not can be regarded as accidental or contingent, but the subcosm and the metacosm are always present, and with them, the potential for life. The fact that this happens rarely in the universe does not affect the inevitability of the process. In a later talk, I will refer to evidence that life is more predominant in the universe than we might imagine, but how often life occurs does not alter the vital fact that it can occur. The interaction of metacosm and subcosm will certainly produce life if the physical conditions are right. Once the conditions are right, no lucky accidents are required. Life will inevitably emerge, and after that will continue to develop. These physical conditions exist on our planet Earth, and it is reasonable to believe that they exist in many other locations in the universe, although the constraint on communication with them is limited, probably absolutely limited, by the speed of light, which is slow relative to the distances involved. So on the one hand, there is the subcosm, and this refers to all inert matter. Inert matter is with us today, and it always has been. So far, what I'm saying is not controversial. But there is another element that is counterparty to the subcosm, and this I term the metacosm. The metacosm refers to the creative impulse that we experience all around us. It corresponds loosely to Henri Bergson's élan vital, or vital force, although it is a more developed concept in my theory. Nevertheless, I am indebted to Bergson for his making this idea of a creative component central to his philosophy, so bringing it into the philosophical discourse. Like the subcosm, the metacosm continually changes, and these changes are central to the cosmic order, as we shall see. What evidence is there for the existence of the metacosm? It is there, visible all around us, everywhere and all the time. You have to be a very hard-nosed positivist or materialist not to see creativity everywhere in the world in which we live. Everywhere there is the beauty of the unfolding of life, in nature and in human initiatives. The idea that all this can be reduced to mechanical processes is not credible for normal people who are not educated into abstract ways of thinking. The world around us is literally full of miracles. Of course, the metaphysical nihilists will argue that we are being fooled, that in fact all is sterile or an illusion. But they are the biggest fools in this, for they deny their own experience of what it is to be alive and to be human. Their arguments can only lead to a destruction of morality, beauty, civilization, humanity, and a deep dissatisfaction with life. Now, there is a third fundamental element in this cosmic order, and this I term the cosm. Cosm quite simply refers to life, and it is the coalescence of subcosm and metacosm that produces life. Unlike its two progenitors, life is not permanent, but is always fragile, unstable, and restricted to a limited time span. But to repeat, although permanent, subcosm and metacosm are always changing according to the workings of the cosmic order. Thus, we are far from the well-known idea of Aristotle's unmoved mover, which he applies as a description of his God. In my cosmic order, nothing is static, unmoved, or unmovable. All is in a state of flux, but this occurs according to definite principles that we can know and understand. This absolutely does not mean that we can predict the future, for it is in the nature of reality, as we shall see in later talks, that it is indeterminate. But it does not mean we cannot know the general cosmic processes that govern these changes. We can understand the principles governing the cosmic order. And one test of the validity of our formulations of this order will be whether it produces any insoluble problems, or logical problems, or empirical problems of the type that Professor Chalmers has confronted. If I should encounter anything as intractable as his hard problem, I would return to the basic assumptions and question them and seek a revision of them that might eliminate any such intractability. There is no point in banging your head against a brick wall. There is little point in busting our brains on problems that admit of no solution after repeated attempts by some brilliant minds. We should rather conclude that there are likely to be faults in the assumptions we made about the cosmic order in the first place. Why not confront them? So in our schema of metacosm, cosm, subcosm, we have accounted for physical processes as they occur in Chalmers' hard problem. But what about their counterparty in consciousness? Well, the cosmic order we have outlined makes life fundamental, but it is surely not much of a stretch at this stage to say that consciousness can proceed from life in evolutionary terms. The first life forms, it is reasonable to suppose, are not conscious, and this would apply to, for instance, plants. But we know that somehow animals with consciousness emerged, even if we have little idea of how this actually happened. But for the present, it is a reasonable assumption that life, as it first occurred, over time gave birth to consciousness. And so in accounting for life in our cosmic order, we have made a start in explaining how it is that consciousness came about. Consciousness, whatever else it may be, is certainly living, and so it must be built on life. Consciousness did not emerge from physical processes or inert matter, as Chalmers would have it, but it emerged from life. Life is the primary element in the cosmos, not inert matter. Life is the fundamental driver of everything. I have said before that my philosophy includes a philosophy of the cosmos. What is the cosmos? The cosmos is the world we immanently know. When I say immanently, I mean that we are excluding anything that may fall into the supernatural realm, or what mystics might call the astral realm or plane. The astral plane means the borderland between the cosmos and the supernatural. So does the cosmos refer to the physical world around us? Yes, it does mean the physical world, as long as we understand that it includes all aspects contained by this world. A life exists in a physical body, and so is part of the cosmos. But a life is not just inert physicality, for it consists of inert motivating force that cannot be defined by inert matter. However, some would like to convince us that it can be. A life is an expression of the élan vital. The cosmos also includes what I have termed the metacosm, which is the driver behind the creation of life. The metacosm is not itself alive and is not living, at least in the same sense as an individual life, but it can create life, and it cannot create life in itself. The metacosm has to work with the subcosm to produce life, but all life has a physical component. Life is, as I have said, the primary constituent of the cosmos, and it comes out of the interaction between the subcosm, that is to say, inert matter, and the metacosm, that is to say, the creative force. This idea is not so difficult to appreciate. Let us look at this oak tree. Now, your bullet-headed materialist will tell you that what you are seeing here is an assemblage of physical matter that has occurred by accident, produced the object you see before you, but you know better. Indeed, we are looking at a material object that is part of the subcosm, but there is more to it than that we see before us. We see distinctly, without question, a creative force that is invested in the physical. The oak tree is saying out loud, I am alive. I am created out of purely physical matter, but I go beyond it. You cannot define me in terms of physical particles. I cannot be so reduced, and I am unique and singular. We are reminded of William Wordsworth's words, and it is my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. To a normal person, with their minds unbent by the reductive abstractions of positivisms, Wordsworth's words contain within them a self-evident truth, albeit one poetically, not directly, expressed. The positivist claims to see only the subcosm, the physically inert, but the rest of us know that we see, as everyone sees, the creative force in the metacosm of the élan vital, present also before us. But, and here is the point, the metacosm comes together with the subcosm. The creative element combines with the physical element to produce a single life, a cosm. Subcosm, cosm, metacosm. This is an essential principle of the cosmic order we are uncovering. And to repeat, in this, subcosm and metacosm existed long before cosm, but it is in the nature of subcosm and metacosm to come together to form life. That fact defines them. That is why life, the cosm, is the primary element of the cosmos, for it defines the secondary elements of subcosm and metacosm. So the fact of subcosm and metacosm existing prior to life has no bearing on the fact of life being the primary element in the cosmos. I now want to talk to a very specific and famous statement of a philosophical problem. This concerns what is usually referred to as Plato's allegory of the cave, and the illustration here gives it a graphic representation. It is taken from a relatively short passage in Plato's Republic, and so it is safe to assume that here Plato was making a point concerning politics or political philosophy. Although the Republic is a long and discursive work, its central theme is of how to design a republican form of government. The allegory of the cave as a political statement can be seen as showing the way that people can get fooled by their rulers, to put it rather crudely. Many of us might sympathize with this message if applied to the present day. However, what is important to this discussion would seem to have little to do with whatever point Plato was seeking to make from his position living in ancient Athens. For in what I have called modern Western philosophy, this allegory is usually seen as posing a question of epistemology. So what is epistemology? Epistemology is quite simply the theory of knowledge expressed in philosophical terms. Remember that to discuss a subject in philosophy means to discuss it in terms of metaphysics, and so that means in terms of the highest generality. So epistemology does not seek understanding of a particular way in which we acquire knowledge of the world in which we live. For instance, we acquire knowledge through books, through the senses, through modern media, through active experience of the world, and so on. Epistemology deals with the most general principles applying to all these means of coming to know the world we inhabit. Epistemology occupies an important, I would say, too important place in philosophy in modern post-antiquity times. Above all, it is discussed as a problematic area, an area yielding endless difficulties that never seem to result in a solution that people can accept. In other words, there is never a consensus. Plato's cave is a good expression of these difficulties and why they are never satisfactorily resolved. So we are going to ignore whatever social or political meaning can be read into the analogy and concentrate on the epistemological interpretation to which it is most usually applied. In the drawing, we are for the moment interested only in the left-hand side of it. There we see some prisoners chained to a bar in a cave. Their movements are entirely restricted so that they can only look towards the back of the cave, having no view of the outside world, and according to this interpretation, no awareness of it. The sum of the world they know consists entirely of what is happening on the back of the wall of the cave, and there are some silhouettes being projected there as shadows caused by the light of a fire burning outside of the prisoner's view. We have to imagine that the prisoners have spent their whole lives in this condition and conclude that their entire experience consists of what is projected on the back of the wall. So this is their world in the sense of all and everything they ever know about. What is important to this allegory is that the prisoner's experience consists only of knowledge gathered by their senses, primarily the visual sense. The argument then jumps to consider us as normal human beings and makes the grand claim that the prisoner's situation is indeed comparable to our own, for we too depend on our senses, and we, like the prisoners, have no way of verifying the knowledge thus obtained. So we too are trapped in a closed situation whereby we have no way of going behind the information provided by the senses. So how can we know that this information is real in any sense? It might all be an illusion, such as the prisoners shackled permanently in the cave endure. This is a primary way in which modern Western philosophy characterizes the human condition, or for that matter, that of animals. It is not the only way, but it is central to the work of quite a few philosophers, and became more and more so as the centuries moved on, until today it still forms a major part of the thinking of many philosophers. What the allegory is illustrating is a philosophical problem of the most fundamental kind, for it is asking how it is that we can know reality, the real world around us, and even whether we can know this reality. If Plato's cave were a true representation of the human condition, it would follow that we cannot really know what is real and what is not, leaving us in a rather depressing situation. The point being made is fundamentally pessimistic and life-denying. Let us take a cold look at this image. Does it not assume that the humans on the wrong side of the wall are really nothing more than cameras? That is to say, they receive images but don't react to them. They just collect them. We could say our cameras also receive sounds and smells, but that does not affect anything, for these are just additional sensations that essentially act no differently from the images. We could make this point a little closer to reality by saying that the camera somehow has a consciousness attached to it. and so indeed fully becomes equivalent to a prisoner in a cave illustration. But the big problem with all this is that we know for certain that humans do not behave as cameras, with or without a consciousness attached. Well, they are far more complex beings in many, many ways. Above all, we can act in the world as well as perceive. And however constraining our shackles may be, we will still be able to act with our bodies in some way. The smallest action will dismantle the point of the Plato's cave illustration, namely to prove that we cannot know the reality that we think we know in a fundamentally real sense. So, if my head is thoroughly constrained in one place and cannot move, my eyeballs can still move, and therefore I can affect a change in the image I receive that depends on me, as well as the external situation. Let us suppose that the eyeballs are somehow fixed in position by some clever advice. There are still myriad types of experience that occur in my body. I may get hungry. Will my guardians feed me? If so, then this gives me a lot more information about my situation that goes way beyond the shadows on the wall. You may say that such considerations undermine the point of this statement as an epistemological problem. Well, yes, they certainly do. But the point is that this illustration is a fraud as a representation of the human condition. As I said, it would work for a camera, but humans are not cameras. The fundamental difference between the two for the present purposes is that humans act in the world as well as see, whereas a camera can only, as it were, see. And this brings me to a big point I wish to make about Western philosophy in general. And this is that it does not consider action as a component of the human condition, as indeed it is of all but the most primitive life forms. This does not apply to plants, of course, as we can assume they do not act in general, although that statement may require some qualification, but that need not concern us here. If the prisoners in Plato's cave cannot know reality, it can only be because they have not the least faculty of action open to them. But this cannot be the case. They are not cameras, but human beings. However limited their actions may be, such actions can still affect changes in what they see, and so their sense of reality must include themselves as beings that act in the world. Before continuing with the argument I wish to make about perception and action, I will indulge in an aside. The point I will make here goes far beyond Plato's cave, but the latter, or rather the way in which it is interpreted, serves as a good illustration for a general criticism of much philosophy as it is practiced. This is a fundamental point that, once understood, demolishes at source a huge amount of political thought. It is just far too dangerous for most philosophers of any period, including and especially those of this century that I have referred to. Plato's cave, as an example, is supposed to be addressing the matter of reality as we experience it, and this, to mean anything, has to mean the whole of reality. There cannot be any corners hiding somewhere that are not covered. But what is missing from the allegory, as habitually expressed, is any sense of the position of the viewer who is observing the cave and its dwellers. Nothing that is seen reflects back onto the individual or philosopher who is making the observations, which then allow them to set up the problem posed and seeks explanation. But if you are covering the whole of reality, you must include the viewer. This is in some ways such an obvious point that it is overlooked. It is a fundamental problem with the experiment. It is easy to see how this defect occurs. Scientific inquiry, or the equivalent even in Plato's day, involves a scientist who stands apart from the experiments and observations they're performing. When a scientist takes some measurements of some parameters, such as the weight of an object, to take a simple example, they're quite apart from the experiment being undertaken. Any characteristics and positioning involved has nothing to do with the scientist. The scientist stands at a fulcrum point quite outside the terms of the experiment. However, a scientist is not trying to describe the whole of reality, but only a very narrow aspect of it. This is not so for the putative philosopher, who is interested in the whole of reality. They may at any time be concerned with examinations of details, but ultimately they have to relate this to everything, including themselves and their relation to the objects of their researches. They need to define and include their fulcrum point from which they can lever their own claims. Plato's cave illustrates this perfectly, for the philosopher is left out of the narrative described. This fact alone is enough to floor the philosophical argument being made, but this is never addressed. You may ask how it is possible to include the observer or philosopher in a philosophical theory or statement, and this is a vital question. As the exposition of my philosophy develops, it will become clear how this can happen. Crucial to this will be phenomenology, which naturally contains within it both observer and observed, both subject and object. That is as far as we need to take this aside for the present, but what has been said will be enough to explain why I have a deep problem with much Western philosophy, both in its method and its formulations of problems. I will now return to the matter of perception and action, which I was developing, and start to explain my own interpretation. Let us return to the discussion here as referenced by Plato's cave. All philosophical statements and indeed we could say all statements of any kind embody assumptions. Now, whereas in everyday conversation or everyday text, these assumptions are usually, but not always, common to the person making the statements and to the person receiving them. They are taken as read, so do not need spelling out. If confusion and argument do occur, it is often because each person has made different assumptions about the matter in hand, and so we get crossed wires. We all know from our day-to-day experience that assumptions can affect us adversely to some degree or another. I assume that the bus timetable is the same this year as last, and consequently, I missed the bus. We have all been there. The well-known saying that assumption is the mother of all errors contains some truth. When it comes to philosophical matters, we cannot allow this degree of imprecision. We must be aware of assumptions we are making and preferably spell them out. Unfortunately, in discussions of philosophy, all too often each party is taken to be working from the same assumptions as the other, and so the need to spell these out is not recognized. The need to define the assumptions is not even recognized, and so the discussion goes blandly on, immune to any corrections that an awareness of the implied assumptions might impose. The cave allegory, as I explained, contains the huge assumption that human beings have perceptions of the world around them, but do not act within that same world. The epistemological discussions that use the allegory as a way of understanding the human condition make this assumption. Needless to say, it is never spelt out, and this means that the discussion is allowed to continue without end and without conclusion. The allegory is a way of describing a problem that admits of no conclusion. Before proceeding with this, and in the spirit of declaring assumptions, I'm going to set out an important assumption that I will make in the philosophy that is to be the subject of these talks. This assumption, I believe, can be regarded as self-evident, and so no justification or proof of it will be necessary, at least not at this stage. It is as follows. The reality that the total experience that each one of us as an individual has can be divided into two parts or two realms. On the one hand, there is the realm of the person that we are, however that may be defined. And on the other, there is everything else, everything that is outside and beyond us. I will term these two components of our reality the self and the externality. This is an absolute division, and it is fundamental to how we live and experience the world. I will expand elsewhere on the justification for this grand assumption, but for now, I will just take it as given. Philosophically, this view is known as a type of dualism, as opposed to monism. With monism, there is no such separation between self and externality, or anything else, for they are all merged together as everything is. In some cases, the self is seen as comprising the total reality. In others, it is the externality. Although advocates of these views would deny the very use of the term self and externality, for in monism, they become meaningless. I refute monist philosophies as we progress, and you will see more exactly why. The Plato's cave allegory also embodies this same assumption of the reality of the self and the externality. And in common with nearly all Western philosophy, it contains an additional assumption, which is, as I've remarked, that human beings have perception of the world around them, but do not act within it. In general terms, this view of reality with its inbuilt assumptions can be expressed diagrammatically like this. In modern jargon, we could say this is a one-way trip. All activity consists of transfers from the externality to the self, and there is nothing in the other direction. In this, it is clear that the self has no way of verifying the inputs it receives. They simply accumulate as data. The data alone cannot in itself provide any confirmation of its truth. And in deeper terms, it cannot confirm that it represents anything that actually exists. Whatever it represents could all be a fraud or a lie. In the diagram, the self is indeed imprisoned in its own shell, as is the prisoner in the analogy in Plato's cave. With this view, we are all prisoners within our own selves. We see shadows and images, but we have no way of referencing these to anything other than those images as they appear to us. So we have no way of constructing the externality as part of our reality. This is essentially the problem that has plagued Western philosophy for a large part of its history and is still without a solution. Except I provided the solution in my writing some time ago, and this solution I will now come on to. Then, with this vexing epistemological problem out the way, we can move on to a more interesting, expansive philosophy. The solution to the cave allegory lies, as is so often the case with problems of philosophy, in the assumptions behind the problem as stated. In this case, the giant assumption is made that our relationship to the external world, or externality, is purely through perception of some kind, or through some way of acquiring knowledge. So the problems of philosophy are reduced to epistemology. It cannot be emphasized too strongly that this assumption runs through much Western philosophy and has bedeviled its progress or lack of it. The fault with this assumption is as simple as it is obvious. I say obvious, meaning obvious to any normal person who is not steeped in the usual philosophical methods. These, I believe, distort and hinder our normal experience of life. The fact is that, as we all know, the self not only receives inputs from the externality, it also affects the externality. How does it do this? It does it through action, bodily action. We not only perceive the external world, we also act in it, using our bodies. Plato's allegory of the cave ignores action. The whole point about the condition of the prisoners is that their action is constrained by chains and shackles, reducing them to simple receiving, perceiving beings or cameras. This is the distorted conception of humans and all conscious beings that runs through Western philosophy, and it represents a huge impediment to the job of philosophy, the investigation of the ultimate nature of reality. So I will now make a simple adjustment to the diagram. This diagram I call the self-externality diagram, and it is fundamental to the expounding of this philosophy. It is elegant, simple, and true. Action now is not only brought into the picture, but diagrammatically plays an equally important part to perception. This surely corresponds to our experience of life. We have left behind us the strife of Plato's cave. We have firmly rejected that view of reality. We perceive the world and we act within it. Any account of our lives that subjugates or excludes action must fail. We, at modern level, dwell in a rational reality. My concept of reality is rather specific to this philosophy. What does this mean? It is easy to think of rationality or reason as just something we do as a habit of thinking, just as we do lots of other things that may be roughly equivalent importance in our lives. It is easy to think this, but it would be to ignore the deep change that humans have undergone in moving from the axial level to the modern level. Rationality is not just an add-on to our lives, it fundamentally characterizes what is different in the present modern epoch from the previous axial epoch. Just as the axial humans say of medieval times, where transcendence, mostly conceived in the form of religious ideas, invaded every aspect of their life. So for us, rationality invades everything we do and think. We may speak of people being irrational, but in saying that, we are still referencing the idea of the rational. We cannot escape it. I'm aware that rationality sometimes gets a bad press in our times, but it is often because people equate it with positivism. Positivism is just a small part of rationality. So what is positivism? Positivism is about what is positively true without a shadow of a doubt. For instance, that the earth goes around the sun or that I am sitting at my computer can be taken as positivistic truths. Of course, there are clever people that will always want to challenge anything and everything we know and know we know. But for the rest of us, positivist truths exist, even if we can sensibly debate exactly where they lie. Science, good science, aims to find positive truth. Science has two aspects, pure theory and applied theory. Pure theory exists in and for itself without reference to the real world. It depends for its validity, not on empirical application, but on its own internal logic. Much of this is mathematical, but it can consist simply of generalized statements about the world. The latter tends to take us away from science, but they can still be examined for their own internal logic. If science remains purely theoretical, then it has limited use, and most people would want science to be useful. We want it to improve our lives. This has been done in many ways in the past, although many people today are aware of the great dangers posed by science. Whether beneficial or not, this is applied science. Applied science can mean doing experiments to test pure theory, or it can mean creating new technologies. In this way, pure theory can be shown to be positively true, and the more this theory is used to create new technologies, the more confidence we have in it. This is the pursuit of positivist truth. I have alluded a number of times to the fact that if a statement, and this includes theories, can be shown to be positively true, then this is not philosophy, it is science. So on this basis, there can be no positivist philosophy, except there is, or rather, there are those that claim to be positivist philosophers. However, the desired pure positivist philosophy is never really achieved, and this for good reason. It cannot exist. The founders of positivism as a philosophical idea is usually accredited to two philosophers of the first half of the 19th century, the Frenchman Auguste Comte and the Englishman John Stuart Mill. They tried to formulate a way by which we could make philosophical statements about the world that would be true in an absolute or positivist sense. This project, for reasons I have given, could not succeed, but it did create a lot of discussion, and it was very influential. In the 20th century, positivism took a new turn. This is called logical positivism, and proponents include Austrian Rudolf Carnap and the Englishman A.J. Ayer. Logical positivism sought to find truth in philosophical statements themselves on the basis of their own internal logic. Now, I would say that internal logic is a necessary requirement of a statement in any field. If a statement can be shown to be self-contradictory, then we need not worry about trying to apply it to the real world. But you cannot build a whole philosophy simply out of the internal logic of its propositions. Such an endeavor is sure to lead to convoluted abstract arguments. This movement has done a lot to remove philosophy from the role it should have, which is to engage with society and contribute constructively to all manner of subjects. Logical positivism is still highly influential in academia. I may have labored the discussion on positivism a little, but it is important to get it into focus clearly in order to differentiate it from rationality in general. Positivism is just one aspect of rationality. Rationality, as I have set out in Talk 2, was invented by the ancient Greeks. It was not that humans were incapable of rationality and reason before the Greek classical philosophers, but the rationality was never the foundation on which their belief systems were built. People used rationality to create magnificent buildings and equally horrible weapons of war, for instance, but they did not theorize about it in any depth. That discovery was left to the Greeks. The Romans were an extremely rational people, and so rationality came to be of great significance in the civilization they created, and we are still beneficiaries of their astounding achievements. But the Romans, like the Greeks, had no real empirical science as we would understand the term, and this confirms what I would wish to insist upon, namely that rationality cannot be simply identified with science. Rationality never went away, and it returned strongly in the period of the 18th century, when it became the underpinning concept of what we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment has, like rationality, suffered from the misunderstanding whereby it is equated with the later positivism. This distorts the deep and broad achievements from the Enlightenment, which we still benefit, even if its principles are currently under attack. Anti-rationalism is a prominent feature of current times, and this is very dangerous, and so we are in need of a massive corrective. This is why the title of these talks refers to a new enlightenment. I used the word irrational in the last section, but this simply means that a statement does not obey the standards that rationality sets for itself. It is irrational to say that 2 + 2 = 5, and most people would agree that it's irrational to say that the Earth is flat, given all the evidence to the contrary. Irrational is quite different from anti-rational, and it is to the latter we must turn to round off this discussion of rationality. It is anti-rationalism that is the antithesis of rationality, not romanticism, as it is sometimes suggested. And anti-rationalism is not the same as irrationalism, which is merely a failure to meet the standards of rationality. Anti-rationalism is a deliberate attack on the whole notion of rationality, and it attempts to undermine rationality and replace it with something different. What that something else might be, we shall see in a moment. We happen to live in a world or in an age when anti-rationalism is becoming increasingly dominant. And so we need to get it clear and focus. In attacking rationality, anti-rationalism is attacking our civilization, or what is left of it, which must be founded on rationality. When we speak of our civilization being founded on Greek and Roman antiquity, we mean that it is founded on the rational world that they discovered. Our civilization traditionally also relies heavily on the spirituality carried in the message of Christianity, but this belongs, according to our terms, in the realms of the transcendental. This means that it does not deal with the strictly rational, and thus it also means it is not against rationality. However, the early Christian fathers were brought up in the classical world, and so it was inevitable that rationality became a part of the Christian teachings. The anti-rational proper could historically only come into being with the rational being firmly in place. It relies on negativity and so needs a positive to come up against. This it declares as rationality. This means anti-rationality must belong firmly in the modern level alongside the subject of its negativity, and consequently its history goes back almost to the dawn of rationality as it arose in antiquity. However, it really gets off the ground in the 19th century as a reaction to the well-established rationality, with, for example, the philosopher Nietzsche. But for an example of anti-rationalism, let us look at the current upsurge in anti-rationality, for this is what presents a major threat in our times and is also what we are most familiar with. Although the roots of this go back to the second half of the 20th century, it now has emerged as a powerful presence in Western society and is one that seeks to overturn the rational values that used to be generally accepted. This we call wokeism. This is not the place to go into wokeism in any kind of detail, and so I would just mention the essential idea that it forms all its manifestations. This is that the individual's reaction to a statement or idea is more important than any governing rationality behind it. Now, an individual's reaction can be anything they like. Under wokeism, all reactions are of equal value, and so we lose any linchpin or foundation for what we believe in. This unleashes the wave of anti-rationalism upon us that we are now witnessing. It is not merely irrational, for it is massively combative and massively politicized. It is the direct attack on rationality. Wokeism shares much with the New Age that I have mentioned several times before, and I would describe it as a further extension of New Age, although while the weapons of the New Age that many of us are familiar with might be the flower and the hippie community, those of wokeism are the aggressive street confrontation and the organized political faction. It is perfectly legitimate and rational to look inwards for truth, but this must concern wider truth, not me-specific truth, as wokeism demands, which is inevitably capricious and narcissistic. Wokeism is the acme of narcissism. I can now move on to the explanation of what I consider to be an important discovery that I have made concerning the way we understand the reality we live in and know, and the nature of that reality itself. This piece of theory may seem to present barriers to its understanding at first, but these are really illusory and result from habits of thinking that we have acquired simply because they are preponderant. These have no necessity and are in fact errors that we have become encumbered with through repetition down the centuries. In fact, the way of thinking I'm about to describe is entirely natural to we humans, but a different, narrower discipline has imposed itself on us, and this has come to dominate the human mind in modern times. This makes for a great handicap in our attempts to understand reality. This preponderant view of reality sees everything we know about as occupying a single continuous space. The space is not defined or even recognized. It is like the fish which lives in the fish bowl. It only knows the bowl and so does not identify it as one bowl amongst many others. Furthermore, all these bowls occupy physical space, and so the actual reality contains dimensions of which the fish in the first bowl is entirely unaware. So it is that people generally see that the space that they inhabit is continuous, which is to say, it has of itself no divisions, either natural or imposed. It is all one. This inevitably corresponds to our way of thinking about the external world, for the interior must be modeled on the exterior if we are to understand it and have a dialogue with it. Whether the interior model is based on the exterior reality or vice versa is a moot point, and one we need not pursue here. The point is, our interior knowledge obeys a similar structure to that of the exterior, which it is directed towards, and vice versa. Both exhibit this quality of continuity. When I say that we tend to appreciate the world as being continuous and use continuity as fundamental to understanding it, what I mean is that our thinking makes easy the crossing between the different types of belief systems that I have identified, without in the least acknowledging that any breach has been made. So, for instance, spiritual matters are discussed in the same breath as philosophical or even scientific matters, without any suggestion that this contains an assumption of continuity that could create difficulty or distortion. So we see God being discussed as if it were a scientific concept that can be debated as to its validity or truth in the same way as, say, gravity is discussed. The observer typically allows themselves the luxury of deciding on their belief in God or not, as they might believe in whether the world is round or not. But surely it is obvious, whatever God might be, that it cannot be a concept or fact that can be treated in the same way as a scientific concept. Let us note in passing that the discussion of God as it can be considered in respect of abstract truth goes back at least to the so-called scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages, who tried to devise proofs of God's existence, as if faith were not enough. They tried to mix the philosophy of Aristotle, which had recently been passed to the West by the Islamic world, where his writings had been preserved and revered. So, in the terms that I have established, they were mixing religion with philosophy, and this was a disaster spiritually and intellectually. They were assuming that religion and philosophy occupied the same continuous mental space and the same continuous worldly space. The scholastics produced a lot of long, barely readable text, but never any conclusions that commanded a consensus. In spite of this difficulty, their influence on Western philosophy has been extensive. I say Western philosophy, meaning that of Western Europe, for they never penetrated the east of the Orthodox Church with their conundrums. This is certainly a factor in the very different character we find in Russian philosophy, of which I spoke in Talk 2. But to return to the central matter, we see that the insistence on the absolute continuity of all and everything that is presented to our consciousness means that God is thrust into a supposedly scientific debate and treated as an object of scientific inquiry. This folly must surely be the legacy of the scholastics. To some of us, that God must be treated as an idea or concept like any other from philosophy or science is obviously nonsense. Now, it is reasonable that those of us who wish to say that you cannot treat the notion of God in this way will need to give a clearer idea of what God is if we are to make our position robust. If you are a Christian, for instance, as I am, then you may resort to the position of your faith to describe God, or you may say he is ineffable, although that in itself amounts to be a description, even if a partial one. But then all spiritual descriptions of God will be partial. I emphasize that I have taken God as an example of an idea that cannot obviously be accommodated within a scientific view, but there are many others. The idea of the soul is a prominent one and displays all the same difficulties of description as does that of God. Inevitably, those who claim to be atheists or godless persons also deny the existence of their souls. As we go on, it will become clear why I consider the position of the supposed atheist and the deniers of the soul as intellectually untenable, by which I mean that such positions are not just wrong, but incoherent. This, we shall see, results from the existence of continuity where continuity cannot and does not exist. What is striking about the position of those who proclaim their godlessness, that is, those who call themselves atheists, is that they never have any problem with the very idea of God itself. For instance, they say they do not believe in God, but this implies that they know what God is. You cannot deny what you do not know. They never ask the question of what God is before denying him, and as if their idea of God is innate, and so there is no need of definition. In fact, this is very close to my position as a Christian, and indeed as a proponent of my philosophy, except, of course, I do not take the second step in the denial. What atheists fail to address is the curious fact that they know perfectly well what God is, so perfectly that they can deny him. My point is that if you know what God is, then you have already admitted him of a certain kind of existence, however that may be expressed. The point is that God is given to the human psyche, wherever and whoever we are. To borrow a term from Martin Heidegger, albeit one Heidegger does not use in this context, we can say God is disclosed. Here we are touching on the vocabulary of phenomenology, whereby the distinction between subject and object is obscured. There is no cause behind God. God simply is. And by denying him, atheists are acknowledging the fact of the givenness of God. This denial is contained in the very word they use to describe themselves as being without God. But of course, their narrow positivist thinking prevents them from seeing this simple truth. The reason why I put the word atheist in quotation marks in the text is that there is in fact no such thing. The claim to be an atheist is incoherent, as will become clear. This is not just casuistry, and this talk will explain and go further to disentangle the knot that atheists tie themselves up in. To repeat, this discussion is not just about God, but God is simply being used at this juncture as a familiar and accessible example of what will be an entirely general point. Massive omission and failure of orthodox Western philosophical theory. I know of no Western philosophy prior to phenomenology that avoids this pitfall. None of those I have identified as metaphysical nihilists that are currently prominent on YouTube avoid it in the least degree. This problem I call the fulcrum problem. Now, there are many so-called problems of philosophy, and quite a number of books have been published with the title, The Problems of Philosophy. I will not at this juncture deal with any of these so-called problems that they raise, but rather concern myself with one they never raise, at least to my knowledge. The fulcrum problem is absolutely fundamental from a logical point of view, and to ignore it is to defy logic. The fulcrum problem arises from the fact that philosophers make claims about reality that do not address the position they themselves are occupying in making these claims. So a crucial aspect of the subject of their examination is omitted, namely themselves. They do not describe any fulcrum point that they occupy in order to leverage their claims. So their philosophy is, as it were, half-baked. It is not all there. This is not a minor detail, but an absolutely fundamental point. It cannot be fudged. Let us take an example from our friends, the metaphysical nihilists. They typically will argue that consciousness does not exist anywhere in the world. If we think we have consciousness, then this is just an illusion. They produce intricate arguments to justify this position, but always ignore the fulcrum problem and the objection to their position that it implies. So the nihilists typically say there is no such thing as consciousness. So the issuer of this statement has no consciousness itself, because there is no such thing as consciousness anywhere in any form. But this is a statement in human language, and as such, it comes from a human being. The very fact that such a being can make this statement must mean consciousness or something very like it. So the very fact of making this statement, it invalidates the statement. Of course, they will argue that there is some kind of circular process which leads from one statement to the world and back to the individual who issued the statement without consciousness being involved, or that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, that is a side issue. But how come we are conscious of this circle? What they fail to recognize, and this is a giant failure, is that they have no position lying outside the terms of their argument to objectively make the argument. It is easy to see how people make this mistake. It is because they are modeling their method on scientific inquiry, which in our times has proved to be so powerful, but that is not applicable to philosophy. This talk is about the problems created by assuming continuity between all types of beliefs or theories. And here we see a prime example of the difficulty that this attempt to impose continuity produces. Scientific inquiry and its rough equivalents down through the ages involves a person, a scientist, who stands apart from the experiments and observations they are making. When a scientist makes a measurement of some parameter, such as the weight of an object, to take a simple example, they are quite apart from the experiment being undertaken. The scientist stands at a position quite outside the terms of the experiment, and any aspect of their positioning has nothing to do with those of the experiment. However, a scientist is not trying to describe the whole of reality, but only a very narrow aspect of it. So that this is not so for the putative philosopher, who is indeed interested in reality as a whole. They may at any time be concerned with the examinations of details, but ultimately they have to relate this to everything, and this must include themselves and their relation to the objects of their researches. They need to define and include the fulcrum point from which they can lever their claims. But this they never do. This problem is not recognized, or if it is ignored. A good reason for ignoring it is that they know at the back of their minds that they have not the first clue of how to solve it. So a collective mentality develops whereby an absolutely fundamental aspect of their inquiries is sidelines. If not one of them brings it up, then they can all continue with business as usual, as if the fulcrum problem did not exist. To take another example, Kant said we inhabit a world of what he called the phenomenal world, by which he meant roughly the world of appearance that we all know. He said we cannot step outside and go beyond this phenomenal world, but behind this is another world we cannot access in any sense, and this he called the noumenal world. I am probably paraphrasing Kant's thought terribly, but this is the basic idea. Whether or not you think this is descriptions of reality could in any way be true is beside the point for the moment. What we see here, as with the deniers of consciousness, is that the seeds of demolition of his claim are built into the argument itself. For if we have only access to the phenomenal world, how come Kant knows about this other noumenal world, which no human can, by Kant's own definitions, can have access? Once again, we see a philosophical argument being made that has no fulcrum point from which to lever it, because the argument itself destroys any such fulcrum. The fulcrum problem, once understood, demolishes at source a huge amount of philosophical thought. It is thus far too dangerous for most philosophers of any period, including and especially those of this century that I have already referred to go near. To repeat, unlike science or any other type of inquiry, a philosophy must address the whole of reality. And if you are covering the whole of reality, you must include the viewer in this reality. This is perhaps such an obvious point that it is overlooked. Plato's cave, which we looked at in talk 2, also illustrates this perfectly, for the observer is left out of the narrative described. This fact alone is enough to floor the philosophical argument being made, and a grand epistemological apparatus that was to be constructed upon it. That is as far as we need to take this for the present, but what has been said will be enough to explain why I have a deep problem with much Western philosophy, both in its methods and its formulations of problems.